Around the year of 2004, another Olympic year, another Olympic Games for me. This was the third one I went to. And again, influenced by journalism. I attended part of Barcelona's Universal Forum of Culture, which was its revival, an attempt to revive, and effectively kind of did, an area of Barcelona I used to live in the northeast of Barcelona. There was an area called Sant Adrià de Besòs, which was really quite impoverished until around 2004. By 2004, it became a new port was there, and skyscrapers, hotels, new apartments, etc. To celebrate this and to try to imagine a new mega event, the city, after years of the legacy of the '92 Olympic Games, set up a number of dialogues. One of them was about journalism. This was attended by professional journalists. Presenters were professional journalists, with the exception of a few academics. Manuel Castells was one of the speakers there. And what was moving about it was at the very final session of the event, they played a tribute to journalists that had lost their lives in conflict situations. And this video tribute, this montage, played pictures, footage of journalists that had died. The very final clip was this handwritten piece here, dedicated to a journalist from Al Jazeera that had died just the day before. And it was one of those conferences that was genuinely moving. People were visibly upset by this experience. And you felt a very strong sense of collegiality across this profession. And again, it reinforced my conviction that this sort of work is rich and valuable and worthy of not just researching, but embedding oneself into, which became a part of the work I did around the Olympic Games. But there were always these dualities, because you go to Olympic Games, you're nobody, you can't really get access to things, you don't have any tickets because they're all sold out. In fact, if you want tickets for the London Olympics, they started registrations yesterday, so you better get in there quick. So what I did was interviewed for the media. You get close to the media at the Games, you get anywhere. So at every Olympic Games since then, I became an advocate for the pro-doping position, which is what I tend to write about, that in fact, rather than restrict athletes' freedoms to use technology to enhance their performance, we shouldn't just allow them to do it. In fact, we're morally compelled to do it, because the position we put them in is one where these technological artifacts are required in order for them to break world records and demonstrate the extraordinary performances that people find value in when they watch elite sports. So this argument, which occurred every Olympic Games, I became part of. The publication of this book in that same year was the moment where I was quite willing to say this was the first genetically modified Olympic Games. A claim that I could not substantiate in any way. There was no knowledge about this. You couldn't identify who was taking what. Anything that's below the radar, nobody knows anything about. So how could anyone claim that it was or was not happening? But the point was that lots of people were claiming that it wasn't happening. And actually the technology to undertake this kind of gene transfer was available. So it seemed to me not only worthy of pursuing, but also worthy of pursuing for its own sake, but also because of the very sophisticated marketing machinery that operated around anti-doping organizations. How do you advance a counterpoint to this level of sophistication? And how can that counterpoint be a way of creating more sophisticated engagements with the issues? Because it was absolutely the case that athletes were not made better off by these policies. In fact, we have a situation where 99.9% of drugs that are used by athletes come via a black market, where there's no control, no oversight. How could this be a good thing? So the Athens Games was the first GM Games by my accounts. Every Olympic Games since then was also the first genetically modified Olympics. And you felt very quickly, you became part of this regurgitation of media narratives around sport that just happened every time a major competition, and actually every time the Olympic Games came about. So in Vancouver, a couple of weeks ago, the same sorts of arguments were set up. Was there something new taking place there? Was there gene doping? Nobody knows. So we play out the debates in the media. It helped me to get close to the Olympic Games, but it also helped to refine my arguments. And I strongly advocate the idea that, in fact, by putting yourself into the media, you become a much more competent academic, and that's something we should continue to do. The Olympic Games, at that point, as a result of these influences around working with media became part and parcel of the research. So at the Athens Games, it was apparent by the growth of new media cultures that it was possible to reach more new people, possible to tell new stories, stories that weren't being told by the traditional accredited media, those people that were paying for the right to broadcast the games and cover it. So at the Games, I was more observant of the protest, the activism that was taking place, covered it, reported what was going on. This example in Syntagma Square, for those that know Athens, it's the main square of, don't know Athens, it's the main square of Athens. It's a protest on behalf of the 23 people that lost their lives in the construction of the Olympic venues. Athens was particularly delayed with its venues, and there was concern about them not being ready. And for that reason, there was criticism that their construction happened too quickly and without adequate health and safety. So this quite peaceful protest took place in a significant venue, but nobody really paid much attention. So it interested me to think about how we could tell these stories, how we could articulate them when they were being neglected by the traditional media. People that were willing to do this weren't operating with the BBC or whatever was the national broadcaster in town, in part because they just didn't have time. There's no time to cover these things because everyone's interested in the sports. So someone had to do it. And people were beginning to do it. People that were just beginning to find the possibility of video blogging as a way of getting messages out there really began in the Athens Olympic Games. And this community of new journalists became an interesting facet of how digital culture was being transformed. 2003, the London Olympic Games had just been won, but it was one of those narratives that became very confused and very complicated because the terrorist attack in London happened around the same period. The G8 summit here in Scotland was taking place. Again, expectations that Britain would deliver in some way to address global poverty. Tony Blair also controversially went to Singapore for the Olympic vote and arguably influenced IOC members to gain their votes. This became part of that story. But the Games were kind of not really celebrated in the way that they should have been, or one expected them to be celebrated. There was a big thing in Trafalgar Square, but because of these other narratives that were taking place in the media, dominating its agenda at the time, that juxtaposition was never really reconciled. At this moment of having won the Games, in the same year, just about a month before, the first product of the genome era, if you like, came onto the market. This was the first commercial test for a sports gene. So you could take this test with a simple mouth swab, send it off to the company, and receive information back about what you're more likely to be good at, endurance events or sprinting events. So if you're still not sure what career you want in athletics, you can take this test, pay $100 and find out. But you can also find out for your kids. And this was one of the things that was raised by this technology, that in fact it wasn't just about individuals deciding what they wanted to do and how they wanted to modify themselves or just use genetic information to make life decisions. As you can see from the brochure, this is also about informing young people to make decisions in their lives. Web 2.0 became popularized at this point. The terminology and the infrastructure that led to this concept of Web 2.0, which was now became part of common everyday language. It was on everybody's lips. It seemed to define an era, if not a set of protocols, that characterized a number of new platforms. But the potential and, again, a new aspiration for this was an era of more responsible enterprise and entrepreneurship. Web 2.0 was about collaboration. It was about sharing data, sharing infrastructures. And so ethically, we saw a revision of digital culture where it was much more centered on people rather than on applications. So I remember at this point, people paying lots of money to get their websites designed. I designed a few for people. And you were charging people for a hyperlink. Writing a hyperlink for them into their website, you were itemizing things in that detail. This became a ridiculous, looking back, it's a ridiculous thing to think about, but it was something that was transformed by the possibility of blogging through platforms that required no more intellectual knowledge than just being able to navigate a website. So that sense of collaboration also began to shift our engagement of digital culture, and again, our expectations of it.